August 17th, 2005, item number 76. Today's guest is Greg from the 5 Questions Podcast.
Podcast411.com. Listen different.
Welcome to the show. I'm your host, Rob, and this is the Podcast 411 Podcast. Before we get into the interview with Greg, a couple quick news and notes. First, one day I'm going to get this introduction in one take. Unfortunately, that day is not today, as this is a multiple number take. I'm off to New York tomorrow, so we're going to keep the news and notes real short. Matter of fact, there are no news and notes other than I'm off to New York for a couple of days, see some family and friends, and hopefully see my cousin Chris. And if I do see my cousin Chris, I'm going to have hopefully some very interesting news to talk about when I get back for Saturday or Monday's show. Let's just go ahead and describe what the 5 Questions Podcast is, and then we'll get right into the interview. The 5 Questions Podcast is a podcast where they ask 5 questions each week. Kind of a surprise there, I know. And then play back some of the responses they receive. Sometimes they read them, sometimes they play back the actual audio that people sent in. They also interview one person and play that interview in its entirety. A few weeks back, actually it was early July, I was one of the people that Greg interviewed. Now this is my chance to turn the table on Greg and interview him. So we're going to go ahead and get into our interview with Greg from 5 Questions Podcast. Here we go. Well, Greg, welcome to the show.
Hey, it's good to be here.
Okay, first question. What was your first computer?
Okay, like many others, I had to research this one. Technically, my first computer would be a Trash 80, a TRS-80, the big black and white ones with the floppy disk drives.
Now, was it the Model 1 or the Model 3? Was it a one-piece unit or a two-piece unit?
It was the one-piece unit.
Okay, so that was a Model 3.
So, it was the Model 3, but the first computer I owned at home was a TRS-80 MC10, which, again, is kind of the little square computer. You hooked it up to the TV. It only did Microsoft Basic, and it even had certain loops pre-programmed into the keys with a function button, so it could make your programming a little bit easier. And it hooked up to a cassette tape in order to store programs. So we would get together tapes of all the noise and feed them in and get a program that ran on 8 bits. And it was a beautiful thing.
Let's talk a little about the first podcast you listened to. Do you remember?
The first podcast I listened to, I believe it was Don and Drew, but I didn't find it in kind of the traditional way that everybody else did. I had actually read an article on Wired about podcasting and thought, wow, this is not only really neat, but something very similar to some previous sound recording I had done before. So I should go check it out. And I ended up going out to Podcast Alley and just kind of looked at what was there and randomly picked up Don and Drew and said, wow, let's see what this is. And listened to it and was just hooked from that moment on. I'm like, oh. And at that time, they were very much about bringing in the shows that were, hey, everybody can do this. Let's get on the mics, do it. So that really got me enthused into listening to a bunch of more things. And I didn't listen to some of the more traditional podcasts until later on when I was starting to get into it.
Well, which ones are you listening today that you would call maybe not traditional or traditional?
The 2 ones that are like really high up on my list and have probably been on my playlist since either I've started listening or they've begun is spacemusic.nl with TC from the Netherlands.
Very good podcast.
And I was drawn to it because it's very similar to a radio show in the U.S. called Hearts of Space that I listened to when I was living in Virginia. And when I moved from Virginia to New England, there's no radio stations that carry that show anymore. So when this podcast came along, I'm like, I've been missing this for 4 years. This is a no-brainer. I've got to listen to this every week. Skepticality is pretty high on the list as well, too.
Well, I noticed, looking back at your show notes, that you had a link to them like right after they launched. So you found them rather quickly.
Yeah, and to be honest with you, I don't even know how I really found them. I think I was surfing the forums and said, wow, talk on skeptical discussions, this is right up my alley. Let's see what this one's about. And I've been hooked since day one. In fact, they were the first people that we had as guests on 5 Questions.
Derek and Soupy are great people and great podcast.
The other ones I'm majorly listening to is the Monster Feet Variety Show, which is a comedy podcast that comes out of Toronto, Canada. The Daily Source Code. Oh, and Real Reviews I'm really starting to enjoy quite a bit as well. And, of course, Podcast 411.
Everyone
and
adds
the M Show.
Yeah, people go, and that was, and of course, Podcast 411. I forgot that one. I don't want to get edited out. Well, yeah, sorry about that, Greg. For some reason, the recording just didn't work this week. I'll have to reschedule you for September.
Come on, you're not a standing sponsor. You don't get top billing.
I know. I'm just kidding. Now, Gary's got that over at the Pickle.
You can have it too, you know.
Yeah.
But we'll discuss that afterwards. The other one, too, is I'm starting to listen to a lot more of the local area podcasters as well, too. So I've been listening to a bit of CC Radio and Accident Hash and the M Show, which is a bit of a change for me because I've been listening to a lot of podcasts for a replacement for kind of talk radio, and now I'm starting to go back into listening to it for new music.
Yeah, there's some very good ones for music. Like you mentioned, space music is a good one. I had Dave from Dave's Lounge on, which is similar genre of music, so I like both of those. There's a good podcast that I put on in the background to just drown out everything else when I'm coding and working and everything but editing a podcast. I found out it's hard to edit audio with audio in the background. Not impossible, but very hard.
Well, it's pretty much the same thing for me, too. I have to be completely focused on the production in order to be able to get the best sound quality out of it.
Just to explain to our listeners the whole format and content of your podcast and where the idea came from.
Well, it kind of, there's a little bit of history here. When I first found out about podcasting, I was like, this is a great concept. And it's one that really kind of challenges the traditional listening model, which the feedback loop on that usually is you listen to a show or you listen to a bit, people respond to it and say, hey, this is really great. They sometimes take that feedback, sometimes don't, and then either repeat it or try something new or tweak it out. So it's kind of like you have the talent, the production, the feedback, the modification, the production, the feedback. And I was like, this is a medium that just naturally allows for interaction, especially with blogs, because when you look at Blogger or LiveJournal, a lot of people blog there not so much to get their ideas out, but to start a conversation with somebody through notes or through comments. And I was like, how do we take this concept and apply it to a radio show? Well, for me, the answer was simple. Take the listener out of the position of being a listener and put them in the position of being the content provider. Because what they have to say is far more interesting than probably anything I could make up. So that's really kind of where the idea was born. That I was like, I need to have a mechanism by which to encourage our listeners to be the show. And I had always played this game of 20 questions with people when I wanted to find out what they were like. So I was like, why don't we just shorten the questions down from 20 to 5 and ask it of our audience, because then they will give us their views on it.
You must have been a brutal first date. I'm sorry.
They're always brutal first dates. Don't you know this? Oh, no, wait a minute. You don't know this. You're married.
So you pull out the 20 questions for the girl. Okay, so what is your flavor of ice cream would describe your personality?
Well, you always remember when you had the bad dates and it's like, okay, I got to keep the conversation going, so let's come up with something here. So I came up with this concept, and also at the time I came up with about 10 other concepts and said, okay, this is the idea I'm going to tack on. This is the one that really kind of is going to take this podcasting medium and maybe push it to another level. So I was like, okay, let's go with it. And I pulled the brakes on it and said, okay, wait a minute. If I'm going to do this, I want to do this in a way that is going to be high quality, low maintenance, and offers as much interactivity as possible. So I could have launched, I believe it was like March of this year. And I actually took the month of March. Like, the idea came about mid-February. And I fleshed it out through the course of February and said, okay, I am not going to start this in March. I'm going to take the month of March and automate a lot of the processes and really kind of flesh out the idea. I think we made our initial announcement of the first set of questions about mid-March, and the first podcast came out on April 1st. With all first podcasts, it had and still kind of has some clunks in it that we worked out.
Everybody's first podcast sucks. Just accept it. Your first one sucks. Your second one doesn't suck as much. And your third one sucks a little bit less than the second one. And when you finally get to your fifth one, you're going, hey, I'm there.
Yeah. But in this one, it's a lot of information that's pushed on the back end for setup. So that's something that's gotten much better as time has gone on. I've picked up a lot of things in terms of presetting questions and planning ahead of time that I had not done in the early shows. It's made the production a lot easier to deal with.
Is there any question that you wish you had not asked out of the questions you've asked so far? You go back and go, oh, why did I ask that question?
I only have one rule when it comes to questions. And this is the first time you're ever hearing this rule. I don't ask a question that I'm not able to answer myself.
Well, I asked my wife the questions for the 29th. I asked her before we went on, and I asked her answers just to see what she gave me for answers. And I go to her, what flavor of ice cream displays your personality and why? And she goes, her response was, well, I really don't think ice cream would be, maybe sherbet. And I'm like, yeah, honey, the rainbow sherbet, okay? Because you're just all over the place on this one. So I thought that was a funny answer.
Actually, we want all our answers. I've had a couple people do one-offs like lately, and I really like when people answer them all. So,
coming up in the future, what are some of the things listeners can look forward to? Any changes? Anything you're thinking about implementing differently?
I don't know if we're going to actually change the format all that much, but it's kind of, some of this is rooted in the original concepts of the shows. Just by the nature of the show, interaction is key, because if it was just me sitting up there saying, hey, I think this should be this, or this should be that, it's a pretty dull show. And what makes the show very interesting is hearing everybody's views and hearing how questions are interpreted and so on. And kind of the original concept of the show was that I wouldn't be reading anything. I'm hoping that we eventually get to a point where we have enough listeners that are calling in or Skyping in or sending us sound files that I'm just splicing together a bunch of sound files, because I think the show is much more interesting when not only do you hear the answers of our audience, but you hear it in their own voice, because then you get the inflections, you get the intention, you get the subtle humor.
Or at least you hope you do.
Or at least you hope you do. Or
right.
At least it makes you think about, if I answered this question this way and they answered it this way, I didn't really think of it that way. In terms of format, as we have more audio, you're going to see a lot more audio from people coming in, because that's the real meat of the show and less of me talking about it. I've been playing around with the idea, too, of trying to get a co-host, because as much as I enjoy doing the cast, I think when you're throwing things back and forth between people, again, it comes back into being more of a conversation, and it makes for a much more interesting show to listen to.
A good suggestion. 22-year-old female, small tattoo on the back. That always helps the ratings.
If I had that, we ain't doing a podcast, my friend. Or at least we're doing a podcast of a completely different genre. That'll be the O-Cast coming to you this fall. We did one last week where the question was, what's your favorite stupid movie? And obviously a lot of people answered Office Space. And so,
well, you had two of my favorites, Office Space and Airplane. Airplane is my all-time favorite stupid movie.
I was so torn to use the O-face comment, because I did have a sound file of him going, she's going to see my O-face. And I was like, I should put this in. God, there's so many quotes. And I got to a point where I had like 20 sound files, so I'm like, I got to throw something out here.
Well, Stripes is another great one for stupid comments.
Which hardly anybody answered. I was totally expecting like Stripes and Real Genius, and there's Top Secret, which is another stupid Val Kilmer.
Oh, that was actually pretty good. I liked Top Secret.
And I expected all of those to show up in there, and like nobody answered Real Genius. There was no Top Secret.
Anybody say anything from Life of Brian? I mean, Life of Brian had some great quotes.
Yeah, we did have quite a few people that just said kind of Monty Python as one whole.
Yeah.
So we had to limit that down to single individual quotes, and in the end, it wasn't popularity that went with the leave out on that. It was total stupidity on my part when I was recording, going, "Oh, Monty Python! I forgot about that."
Let's not forget to tell our listeners where to locate your show.
You can find us at 5questions.net, and it doesn't matter whether you use the number or the name. We have both.
Hardware-wise and software-wise, what are you doing to put together your show?
For 90% of the show, what I'm doing is I have a Shure handheld mic going into a simple Radio Shack 4-mic mixer, and that outputs to an external Creative Labs sound card, which goes into the PC, and we record with Acid. And on the back end behind Acid, I also have SoundForge to manipulate any sound files. For the Skype calls, what we do is I run Skype on the Mac and run the Mac into the mic mixer as a stereo input. Mm-hmm. And then that still just gets recorded back to the PC. I found that if you try to do a lot of those recordings on the same machine, you run into a lot of cable and feedback loop issues.
Delay or overhead, voice pitch shifting, all kinds of issues. Yeah.
Yeah. So I spend the $400 and buy a Mac, and your life will be so much easier, and you'll have so many choices.
Absolutely.
So it's weird though, because I've talked with a couple of people, and they've been like, they would run Skype on the PC and then feed it over to the Mac and record into GarageBand. And I'm like, you've got it all backwards, my friend. Go the other way.
Well, I guess it depends, what they like to record on. I actually record on the iRiver. So I go from the Mac, I play Skype on the Mac, I bring it out into the mixer and take my audio in through the mixer, and everything gets recorded on the iRiver.
I was saying, we kind of discussed this last time too, that the reason I went with Acid was I had it for about 2 years, and I was very familiar with the editing tool in it. And it's by no means a professional editing suite. However, it's pretty damn close. And it was just the right tool, and I knew how to set levels, and I knew how to get the best quality out of it. So the learning curve for me was like nil.
What advice would you like to offer to those that are looking at starting a podcast today?
Well, there's a couple things, and I'll say the first one separately so you can edit it out if you want to. Okay. Take the advice that Don Maselli gave everyone, which is, hey, you, slacker, just do it. I mean, it's the best advice I ever got, was just someone saying, go ahead and do it. Don't think about it. Don't worry about concepts or shows or whatever. Just get off your butt and do it. We're all doing it. It's fun. Go.
That's good advice. That's what I want to hear. Just do it, like the Nike said.
Exactly.
Don't worry if you're good or you're bad. You'll get better. You're going to suck no matter what you think you're doing.
I mean, if you look at all of the major radio shows out there, they didn't start in the number 1 or number 10 market. They didn't start, with a broadcast deal on National Public Radio for hundreds of dollars. They started off doing a show that they knew was going to suck, and they tweaked it and played with it and did different shows and had fun. And it was just a matter of that they did, and they got better over time. You're not going to hit the home run first time out. And the people that are hitting the home runs the first time out won't hit the home runs for years and years and years. So don't stress over stuff. Just go and do it.
One last question is, did we miss anything? Anything you'd like to say about the show that we didn't cover?
I guess the one thing is that I just wanted to really get across the point that, the show is very interactive, not only from a show perspective, meaning that the audience is providing the content for it, but our audience is really good at telling us what they like and what they don't like. And about half of the features that exist on the show now are because our listeners have asked for them. And I really tend to think about this show not so much as my show as it's everybody else's show. This is the podcast show for the person who doesn't have the ability to podcast. They can call a 206 number, record their answers, and be in a show. And that's the beauty of this, is that this show really can reach everybody, and you can be a star of a podcast. All you've got to do is just call us up or tell us what you think. And it doesn't take that long. So, again, just do it.
Well, Greg, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Well, folks, that concludes our interview with Greg from the 5 Questions podcast. Please check out his podcast if you're into interview podcasts or want to hear some great responses to some great questions at 5questions.net. Greg, thanks again for coming on the show. It was a blast. At the end of today's show, we'll be playing a promo from, I kid you not, Smelly Monkeys. Not sure how they differ from the less olfactory offensive variety, but at the end of the show, stick around for a promo for Smelly Monkeys. And our next guest will be Kat from the Catfish podcast, so come back on Saturday for that one. Well, that's going to do it for us today. I'm off to New York. I will catch you on Saturday, again, with the Catfish podcast. Until the next time, this is Rob from Podcast 411, reminding you to listen different.
Are you my daddy? I'm 7 years old, and my name is Trevor.
Right.
And I like sports.
We all do, don't we? Mm-hmm. My name's Gareth, and I like Trevor and Simon.
My name's Simon, and I'll be talking about animals.
You will?
Mm-hmm. Come visit us at www.smellymonkeys.com.
Sometimes the answers are difficult.
So, can I ask a question? Mm-hmm. What's the difference between a crocodile and an alligator?
Crocodile... Actually, it's very hard to tell, but I believe that they live in different states.
Okay, that's fair enough.
Or countries.
Sometimes the answers are easy.
Today I'm going to be talking about Wimberley, which my dad really wanted to be hearing about.
Is that your sports report for the day?
And I have some more, and it's an England one. I'm talking about the England area.
So Wimberley this year is in England?
Yes.
Huh, interesting.
Sometimes the answers are impossible.
Sorry to interrupt, what's that thing in the sky?
What thing in the sky?
It looks like on Star Wars, you know that thing that once a night?
Hold on a second, let's interrupt this broadcast. We're probably the first podcast to see a UFO. We even beat Adam Curry. So Simon, since you saw it, why don't you give the report out?
Well, it was kind of a circle like a planet, I thought. And it was a little blending in with the sky because it was this green at sunset at Crocodile.
But there's always smelly monkeys.
I've been waiting for this my whole entire life, even though I
Your
didn't
whole
know.
entire life? How many years would that be?
7!
Whew, that's a long wait.
Check us out, smellymonkeys.com, the Smelly Monkeys podcast. Enjoy.
Come to www.smellymonkeys.com.
Smelly monkeys. Smelly monkeys.
Find us at smellymonkeys.com. Oh, there's one.